Chapter Review. The three main arguments for protection and restrictions on trade are the national security argument, the infant industry argument, and the dumping argument. Each of these arguments is flawed. Other flawed arguments for protection are that protection saves job, allows us to compete with cheap labor, foreign labor, brings diversity and stability, and penalizes lax environmental standards. Tariffs are imposed in some nations to gain revenue for the government. More generally, trade is restricted because of rent seeking from those who benefit from trade restrictions. Practice problems. The first one, Japan sets an import quota on rice. California rice growers would like to export more rice to Japan. What are Japan's arguments for restricting imports of California rice? Are these arguments correct? Who loses from these restrictions in trade? The main arguments are that Japanese rice is better quality rice and that the quota limits competitions faced by Japanese farmers. The arguments are not correct. If Japanese consumers do not like the quality of Californian rice, they will not buy it. The quota does limit competition, and the quota allows Japanese farmers to use their land less efficiently. The big losers are the Japanese consumers who pay about 3 times the US price for rice. Second, the United States has from time to time limited imports of steel from Europe. What arguments has the United States used to justify this quota? Who wins from these restrictions? Who loses? The US arguments is that European producers dump steel on the US market. With an import quota, US steel producers will face less competition and US jobs will be saved. Workers in the steel industry and the owners of steel companies will win at the expense of US buyers of steel. Third, the United States maintains an import quota on sugar. What is the arguments for this import quota? Is this argument flawed? If so, explain why. The argument is that import quota protects the jobs of US workers. The argument is flawed because the United States does not have a comparative advantage in producing sugar, and so an import quota allows the US sugar industries to be inefficient. With free international trade in sugar, the US sugar industry would exist, but it would be much smaller and more efficient. Fourth, in the news, Indonesian Beeman Hollywood blockbuster blackout. The Indonesian import tariff on Hollywood movies was meant to protect local filmmakers, but major Hollywood studios withdrew their films. This is the source. The source is the Jakarta Post, July 6, 2011. Now the question is, what argument is Indonesia using against free trade with the United States? What is wrong with Indonesia's argument? Indonesia is putting infant industry argument to protect its movie industry, allow it to mature through learning by doing, so that Indonesia will develop a competitive advantage in movie production. What's wrong with this argument is that protected industries generally perform poorly and the country does not develop the comparative advantage. Fifth, how do you respond to a speaker who says that we need to limit auto imports from China in order to save US jobs? Saving jobs is one of the oldest arguments in favor of protection. It is also incorrect. Protecting a particular industry will likely save jobs in other industries. The cost to consumers of saving a job is many times the wage rate of the job saved. Sixth, what is the dumping arguments for protection? What is its flaw? Dumping occurs when a foreign firm sells its exports at a lower price than its cost of production. The dumping argument is flawed for the following reasons. First, it is virtually impossible to detect dumping because it is hard to determine a firm's cost and the firm fair market price. Second, it is hard to think of a good that is produced by a global natural monopoly. Third, if a firm truly was a global natural monopoly, the best way to deal with it would be by regulation. Seventh, why is it incorrect to assert that trade with countries that have lax environmental standards need to be restricted? The assertion that trade with developing countries that have lax environmental standards should be restricted to punish the developing nation for its low standards is weak. Everyone wants a clean environment, but not every country can afford to devote resources towards this goal. The rich nations can afford this expenditure of resources, but for many poor nations, protecting the environment takes second place to more pressing problems just feeding their people. These nations must develop and grow economically in order to afford to protect their environment. One important way to help these poorer nations grow is by trading with them. Through trade, these nations' incomes increase, and with this increase, also increases their ability and willingness to protect the environment. Eighth, suppose you get a job working for Frito-Lay, the maker of corn chips or other snacks. Frito-Lay is a big user of corn. Corn can also be used to produce ethanol, and increasingly more ethanol is being used as a replacement or additive fuel for gasoline. Currently, the US government places no tariff on ethanol imported from Brazil. Suppose a hefty tariff is proposed. As a representative of Frito-Lay, would you be in favor of this tariff? Explain your answer. The tariff on ethanol imported from Brazil would severely limit the quantity of ethanol that can be imported, and by doing so would push the price of ethanol in the United States higher. The high price for ethanol increased demand for US corn to process into ethanol. The higher demand for corn means that the tariff on ethanol pushes the price of corn in the United States higher than it would be in the absence of the tariff. As a representative of Frito-Lay, your interest lies in lowering the price of corn. Consequently, you would not be in favor of the proposed tariff. Ninth, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez opposed the creation of a free trade area of the Americas, that is FTAA. Why? Who did he think will gain or lose? Do you think he is correct? Mr. Chavez argued against the free trade area of the Americas because he thought that poor workers in nations such as Venezuela and other poor countries would be harmed by the trade. He also worried that US firms would come to dominate markets in other countries. He was incorrect on both counts. First, poor workers in Venezuela would benefit from increased trade with the United States because the trade would increase the demand for their labor and thereby lead to higher wage rates. Second, it was unlikely US firms would be able to dominate markets in other countries because to do so, US firms would need some sort of cost advantage over their foreign rivals, which was unlikely. 10th, Hong Kong has never restricted trade. What gains has Hong Kong reaped by unilaterally adopting free trade with all nations? Is there any arguments for restricted trade that might have benefited Hong Kong? Hong Kong has one of the most successful economies in the world as a result of adopting unilateral free trade. Both its export and imports increased the result. There really isn't any argument for restricted free trade that might have benefited Hong Kong. So these are true or false problems you can see by yourself and multi-choice questions.